Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Barb Tyson, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Salty Dog webinar. With us today, we have Will and Sarah Curry from Hydrovane International Marine. They're going to be presenting Windvane self-steering. Sounds like a great presentation, and we'll get started in just a second, but please remember to keep muted and keep your video off, but feel free to write your questions in the chat box that I've opened. And if you don't see that chat box, just hover over the bottom or top of your screen and you should see chat box and you can open that up. And Will and Sarah would like to encourage you to write in your questions as you think of them. They're going to hold them till the end, but go ahead and type them in that chat box. And as always, we're recording this webinar and I'm going to send out a link to everyone who's registered. That way you can review it if you're joining us live today, and it'll be available for those who can't make it. So let's go ahead and get started. You can take it away, Will and Sarah.
Thank you so much, Barb, for that nice introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'm assuming you can.
Yep, audio is great.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you. Hi, everyone who's here, and hello to everyone who's going to watch this at a later date. I'm Sarah Curry, my husband Will, and we're here to talk about Windvane self-steering. So let's get started. If my clicker works. There we go. So what we're going to talk about today, a little bit about us and Hydrovane, which is our family business. We're going to do some Windvane 101, talking about the different types. And also we're going to step back and do an actual demonstration on the Hydrovane. We'll cover autopilots, emergency steering, and then talk about some details for installations. And we will definitely leave time at the end for Q&A. Here are a few photos from the Curry family album. On the left is actually Will cruising with his family, his parents, 25 years ago. That's crazy. And on the right, my face is covered, but that's a photo just taken a few months ago of us on our boat, which is currently in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, with our twin boys. So it's interesting how cruising kind of goes through the generations, and cruising families pass it on. And Barb, we were just talking about that too, which is so lovely.
Once you get bitten by the bug, it's hard to shake it.
We also, especially for this Salty Dog seminar, we wanted to introduce our other family member, our dog, whose name is Salty. And this is him when we were sailing down the California coast a few years ago. I'm not sure if he was having a great time, but he looks cute. So the history of Hydrovane, and this is a Hydrovane Windvane behind us. It's actually been around for 50 years. It was commercialized in 1968 when it was designed by a British engineer. And there were multiple models until it kind of landed on a model that works really, really well. And in 2002, Will's parents had come back from cruising, and they didn't quite want to return to their careers. I think cruising does that to you as well. And they were looking to purchase a Hydrovane for their next boat to go offshore again. And instead, they found out that Hydrovane was for sale. So instead of one Hydrovane, they bought many Hydrovanes. And Hydrovane has now been owned and operated by the Curry family for almost 20 years. So we manufacture in England, and our office is in Canada. And of interest is that the last 10 years is where we've done some really, really major developments to allow Hydrovane to steer bigger, heavier, faster boats, which is kind of the way that the cruising boat market has gone.
Boats are only getting bigger and faster.
Right. To give us a little bit of credibility here talking about it, we've sailed a lot offshore as well. So we bought our first own boat in 2012, and we sailed that over to Australia. This photo is just casually cruising in Fiji, and as one does, just hanging out on the boom. And so we've put a lot of miles. Our current boat, we've sailed down to Mexico, and Will also has sailed with a number of other self-steering types.
Yeah, I sailed with Windpilot, which is a German servo pendulum system, to the Galapagos. And I've also used a trim tab style auxiliary rudder on the trip from Mexico to Hawaii and then Hawaii back to Vancouver.
Yeah,
And then of course the Hydrovane on both of our boats.
So Windvane 101, starting with the basics. What is a Windvane? So of course, it is a mechanical device, which means it requires no electrical power, unlike your autopilot. And the other main consideration is that it steers a wind-based course, unlike a magnetic compass course, which many autopilots steer to. So you're actually setting your vane at a specific angle to the wind, and it's going to keep you at that angle to the wind on that point of sail for as long as you want until you change it. And of course, it's mounted on the transom. If you're mounting your wind vane on the bow, stop. Yeah, back to square one on the transom.
You'd be amazed how many people at boat shows, actually we get some power boaters.
Oh yeah.
Oh, would this work well for my boat? I just shake our heads. Nothing wrong with being a power boater, but
no.
Anyway, this is in, so as we were going across the Pacific, we sailed from Mexico to Australia, we kind of tried to do sort of informal surveys in each of the main crossroads. And one of them is in Naiafu, Tonga. And in Tonga, there was 26 cruising boats, active cruising boats. And out of those 26 boats, 19 of those boats had Windvane self-steering. So it's kind of interesting to note that because, you know, when you're at home in your home waters, you know, you walk down the docks and the majority of the boats don't have wind vanes. While the reality is the majority of those boats don't need them because they're not going anywhere. In the photo, you can see that's our previous boat, HydroQuest, that's got the Hydrovane. The middle boat is an older Camper Nicholson with an Aries wind vane, which is a servo pendulum unit. And then some Swedish friends of ours on a little Allegro 27 that sailed all the way from Sweden with a smaller, lightweight servo pendulum unit. So it's kind of interesting to see what people were using. This is a very important quote. This is probably one of the most important things, quotes that you'll get out of this presentation. Second only keeping the boat afloat is keeping her pointed in the right direction. And the reason why this is so important is because, you know, we see so many people at boat shows that get, you know, you Google and all over all the fancy electronics and things that you can add to your boat. And, oh, it'd be nice to have a washer dryer, and it would be nice to have a water maker.
A
and
washing
all these
machine
things.
would be nice.
Well, of course, they would all be nice. But the reality is when you know, everything goes bust, you got to make sure that the boat's floating and you can able to point her in the right direction. So we'll get into the different types of systems. This starting point would be with the servo pendulum units. And so what a servo system is doing is actually taking a signal from the vane, right? So the same principle with all wind vanes is that you're steering a wind-based course, you set the leading edge into the wind, you know, based on what point of sail you're on, and it sends a signal, so the vane will flop over, and as the vane flops over, it sends a signal down to the servo oar, which twists, and as it twists, it shoots off one way or the other, to port or starboard. And as it does that, it goes through blocks and lines and actually attaches to the main steering. You can see there's a small little hub that the lines attach onto, and then that drives the main rudder. The other option, of course, is if you have a tiller steered boat, it goes straight onto the tiller. Or you can go to like Cape Horn, which is another type of servo system that actually has a 3-inch hole that you drill through the transom and attaches directly to your quadrant. But they're all using the same principle.
And they're all reliant on the boat's main steering and main rudder to function.
Yeah, so it generates its power from the servo oar in the water. So boat speed generates power. That's important.
One nice thing definitely that a lot of people do like is the fact that the oar can actually be swung up out of the way. So if you're in a marina, you can actually kick it up. It has a hinge.
Yeah. And the Achilles heel for any servo system is friction. So if you've got a lot of friction in your main steering, you want to try and do something about that, and you want to try and minimize the number of blocks and length of lines going to the wheel. Next type of system would be a servo auxiliary rudder unit. There used to be 2 or 3 manufacturers of these, and from what I understand, nobody is manufacturing these anymore. What you see there is the Wind Pilot Pacific Plus, which is basically a servo that's driving its own rudder. So the difference is that it's not actually linking to the main rudder, it's actually driving its own rudder. due to having multiple appendages in the water and the construction costs, most of them were just not economical to make, and they had failures they had to overcome. So it's a bit more complex. Third type would be auxiliary rudder, and there's two types of auxiliary rudder systems. So one would be a trim tab style system, which is what you see here. And this is an example of the auto helm, which Scanmar produces. And it's basically a vertical axis vane that directly links to a trim tab, and the trim tab turns, which drives its own rudder. So it's using its own rudder, it's independent. One of the negatives is the rudder is always on. You can't take it off. There's no way of kicking it up or dropping it off. So it is a permanent fixture on the boat. And then the other type of auxiliary rudder, which is what the Hydrovane is, would basically be a direct drive to a semi-balanced rudder. So it's got a vane, and it generates its power, as with any auxiliary rudder unit, from the vane. So the size of the vane is what drives the rudder.
It gets its signal, but the vane is so big because that is where we are getting the power. It has nothing to do with the boat speed. It's all from the wind.
Yeah. Yeah, so the vane, you can see the vane is quite large, and it actually goes through the ratio control gears that can be geared up or down as needed. And they drive the rudder, which is semi-balanced. And because it's semi-balanced, it takes very little power to turn.
Yeah, so for the Hydrovane, the vane is much bigger than other types. And we'll show you the vanes in a second. Oh, right now. So what we're going to do is we're going to step back, and we have a Hydrovane here. So Will's just going to take you through kind of the operation, how you set it up, and how you would get it working. So I'm just going to move with my computer over here. And this is my Pilates exercise for the day, trying to hold my screen straight while not shaking. So I think we're a big video now, and over I come. Okay, so to start, tell us what you're doing.
So let's just move it so I can actually see that. That's better. Okay, so any wind vane always steer in a parent wind base course. So what we do is we've got this line here, which is an endless loop. And usually you run this up to the cockpit, somewhere near the helm, or somewhere that you can be anywhere in the cockpit and easily reach it. So what we do is we get the leading edge into the wind. So let's say we are beam reaching, right? So the boat's going this way. This is the unit, we're facing this direction. The apparent wind is coming from here. So if we bring that around, you can see the vane. So I've got the leading edge into the wind, the counterweights into the wind. And we lock off the helm in that sweet spot that balances out the boat, so that the boat's not wanting to pull one way or the other. The boat has to be tracking nicely before you engage the vane. Sail trim and boat balance is imperative for any wind vane, or even autopilots actually. So we come back here, we've got the main rudder locked, so it's fixed.
Let me get in there and see what we're talking about here with these controls. So the unit disengaged, what does that look like?
So that's here. So I've got the ratio knob all the way in the right position, and the rudder and tiller are basically just free trailing. And I've also released the shaft locking pin. So the locking pin normally sits here for when you're motoring. That fixes it. And now we've released it as we're sailing and the unit is disengaged.
And let's quickly mention the rudder as well. So the rudder is down below here, and this is just a cutoff version for demonstration purposes. The actual rudder is much longer, and you can see it in the background there. And we'll bring that over to show you just after here.
Okay, so we've got the vane into the wind, we've locked off the helm, the boat is nicely balanced, and come back here and engage the unit. So we change the ratio control knob to the engage setting. There's 3 different settings, which I'll get into. And now what happens is, if we stand back a bit, so you can try and see the whole unit, as the boat starts to fall off course, the apparent wind changes, which puts pressure on the vane, which knocks it over. And as it goes over from side to side, it's actually driving the rudder. So it's got its own rudder that it's directly linked to.
And that's it?
That's it, simple as that. The concept is actually quite simple. There's more fine-tuning things that we can get into. But the concept of what it's doing is as simple as that. Leading edge and vane into the wind, you're steering a wind-based course. and it's driving its own rudder, and your main rudder is fixed. Your main rudder is actually a big part of the Hydrovane's performance because it's acting as a trim tab. So if you have any weather helm or lee helm that you need to overcome small amounts, you can actually offset a few degrees, lock it off, and then that delivers the Hydrovane with a balanced boat.
Now, what would you do if you were in really, really heavy conditions?
Yeah, good question. So what we do is we've got the different settings here. There's 3 different settings. If we can come just see. Yeah, so here we go. So we've got far left, middle, heavy weather setting, and disengage. So when we put in the far left setting, this is our light to moderate conditions. It's a little bit hard to see there, but what it does is it changes the leverage here. And if you look down at the rudder, which we might not be able to see that easily, it's actually only moving the rudder 15 degrees, but that gives you more power for the vane. So any little wind shift, the vane's flopping over and it's sending a signal to the rudder. As the wind picks up, we can go to a 2-to-1 and even down to a 1-to-1 ratio here, which gives us more rudder deflection. So now we've got 35 degrees rudder from side to side. So we've got more power. And on top of that, if you come up here, you can actually depower the vane by raking it down to 30 degrees. So the vane goes from vertical, which we can't quite do here because we've got a roof clearance issue, all the way down to 30 for real heavy extreme conditions. And the reason for this is that if you have the vane upright and 35 knots of wind, it's just basically going to oversteer because it's got too much sensitivity. But if you do this, you actually are effectively reefing the sail. Now with other servo pendulum units, how they deal with this is they actually have different size vanes. So they'll put in a smaller vane in heavy conditions and a bigger vane for light air sailing. We don't do that because we can change the inclination from 0 to 30. So it's the same size vane for all systems, except for the fact that we have different size vanes to accommodate aerial obstructions, which we'll talk about later.
What do you do if you're motoring and not using the
system? So if you're motoring, you basically just want to disengage it. So again, back to the ratio knob, all the way to the right. That disengages it, so the rudder's just free trailing. So when you're sailing and you're not using it, it's just basically following the wake of the boat. And if you're going to be motoring, we pin it. And by pinning it, it locks at 4.5. You can't go anywhere. And if you're coming into a marina and you don't want the rudder on there, what you can do is you can get down with a boat hook, or if you've got a swim platform, you can get down and actually pull the pin. And we're going to show you a separate video on how you take the rudder on and off.
What breaks? Or what needs replacement? What wears?
Yeah, the biggest wear points would be the drive sleeve. The vane cover will deteriorate in the sun, just especially in the tropics. And locking pins will fatigue over time, especially from motoring. If you've got a big prop and lots of prop wash, it'll fatigue the pin. But not much. I mean, the unit is definitely over-engineered to withstand a lot of abuse. Most people aren't replacing that drive sleeve for at least 10 to 15,000 miles.
And it's $4. So
it's a $4 part, yeah. And then as far as maintenance goes, when you wash the boat, wash the unit, grease is bad. Don't grease anything on it. We spray it with WD-40 just to sort of get all the salt and oxidation off of it. And if you want to keep it looking nice, you can spray the castings with some corrosion inhibitor spray, like T9.
What about the vane? Can you store it down below when you're not using it?
Yeah, so spin the vane off, release knob, put on the back of the cabin door, get out of the sun. This is the stubby vane, which is our shorter, wider vane. So this vane is basically designed for installations with arches, or if you've got a wind generator or something nearby that we need to accommodate. The normal standard vane, I don't know if we have one.
A very faded version. Yeah. This is what it looks like after a couple of years.
That's a couple of years on the tropics, but that's so you can see it's a thinner foil with more height. Final thing I should just show you is the emergency tiller. So if you do want to use it as an emergency rudder.
We're having a vane issue.
If you do want to use it as an emergency rudder, you just disengage the unit, right? So it's disengaged, And you actually have a tiller extension that goes into this 3/4 inch hole. A bilge pump handle also fits. And then you can actually sit here and use this as your tiller and rudder. So for any race that requires a backup rudder, this is a good solution.
Wonderful. Okay, so let me just get back to sharing screen here, and this should be somewhat seamless, I hope. There we go. So thank you, Will, for that demonstration. And if there are any questions about operation, we can always just go back to that when we get to the Q&A. So I do have a little video here, and this is just, we do get the question a lot about how hard is it to take the rudder on and off. And so I have a video, and for the recording version of this, I can, if there's any kind of delay, I can splice in the version off my computer here. So we'll play it and hope it goes well.
Okay, so quick maneuver on the stone rudder. What we're doing, this is a good little tip, is we actually drill the hole right in the handle. And what that does is it creates a center of gravity for the rudder, whatever you want to call it, pivot point, so that when I'm holding it in the water, it folds up and down. So it's not trying to stay cockeyed, and that makes a big difference for getting the rudder. So I've got it tied off here at all times, very important. Lower the rudder on. Get it onto the bottom of the shaft. Wiggle it up. The drain hole on the side will spit the water out. And I've got the rudder pinned up here, so that the rudder should be the fore and aft. Insert it in the hole. It should be a tight friction fit. And then get the little arm pin lanyard. So when I want to take it off, I just pull the lanyard, pull the pin, the rudder drops off. Because the rudder has negative buoyancy, it's very easy to get off. It's trickier to put on, so you're going to put it on in the marina or at anchor in your dinghy before you leave port.
Yeah, so hopefully you heard that. The rudder is easier to get off because you pull the pin and it drops, and you make sure you have a line on it. And it's a bit trickier to get it on, but it's really not that tricky. Now, another video here just to show in action what a Windvane looks like. So this was a video sent to us by customers on their Halbergrassi 43 crossing the Atlantic.
All right, we are in the process of changing the guard here. Dennis is coming out from behind the wheel. This morning. What do you got to say for 2 weeks on the boat, Captain?
Hey, this is start of a great beginning.
We want to get a picture of some of these waves coming up on the side over there. Got the Hydrovane, which seems to be doing its job. Oh, look at here. Look out. 2 of those come up over the boat. Okay, say goodbye. Goodbye, Dennis.
Goodbye.
So, you know, it's kind of one of those things where it's easy to demonstrate here, but out in open ocean, you know, you can see the situations are a little bit different. When we set our Hydrovane heading to the Marquesas, we set it and we literally didn't touch the wheel or the Hydrovane other than minor course adjustments for like the first week.
Until we hit the equator.
Yeah. Your job with Windvane. So there are, I like to just sit back and relax, but there are a few things you do have to stay on top of.
Yeah, sail trim probably being the most important part of the equation. As I've touched on, you know, if the boat isn't balanced properly, the vane will not steer. If you have a hard time steering, the vane will have a hard time steering. So you've got to make sure that if you're going downwind and you're in a following or rolly sea, always have a pole on the headsail to stabilize the sail. Make sure that your sails aren't too big. You know, deck sweeping racing sails are always problematic for offshore cruising. So make sure that they have good shape, and also the big thing, don't overpower. So reef early. You know, majority of the time, reefing does nothing to your boat speed, and the boat is more comfortable, and the vane or the autopilot will steer much better. Sail trim and boat balance is imperative, and really with autopilots it should be the same way. It's just that we get a little bit lazy because you press auto and you don't care too much about sail trim, and that's why a lot of autopilots fail, you know, or they become real power hogs because the boat is just not trimmed out properly. And also one other little tidbit is make sure you note that the vane, the wind, the apparent wind that the vane sees down low, you know, on the boat can be quite different from the apparent wind at the top of the mast. So you really want to be steering by what the vane sees and what it's feeling.
And watch your heading, because as the wind shifts, and often this is gradual offshore, your course will shift. And when you're doing a long passage, you know, 3, 4, 30 days, it doesn't really matter if you're not, you know, straight on your course, but often this is gradual. And adjusting to conditions, we talked about this. So for the Hydrovane, you depower by gearing down in heavy conditions. And for other systems, you're going to go to a smaller vane.
So this is a good example of steering with a Windvane. So you look at that course, you're like, wow, it's not holding a very good course. And this is between Fiji and Vanuatu. And actually what happened was we left Fiji, the wind was forward of the beam for the first time in our Pacific crossing. And we were close reaching to close hauled, and it was actually quite uncomfortable.
It was not comfortable.
We were taking waves over the bow and things were wet, and it was just 20 to 25 accelerated trade winds. And we said, you know, let's just fall off. Maybe we're going to end up on an island further north, but let's make the boat more comfortable. So we fell off onto a close reach, or, you know, maybe even slightly after that. And we never changed it. And that's what our course ended up being, because what happened is the vane, of course, because it's following the apparent wind, the wind became more easterly and the boat came around, and basically we ended up right on course, didn't touch anything with the vane. We may have steered a few more miles, but the boat was probably sailing more efficiently and a lot more comfortable.
Yeah, I do remember that. I'm glad we made it where we wanted to go. We love our autopilot. So a lot of cruising boats have autopilots, and we certainly do on ours as well. And it's great for certain conditions.
Yeah, they both have their time and place, for sure.
So for offshore sailing for longer distances, the amperage draw of an autopilot 24/7 can be quite astronomical. Dependence on other systems, of course, is another factor. So dependent on your charging system, dependent on your batteries, dependent on your boat steering system. So there's just a lot that goes into it. And I do love this photo of Will, because that's when he was checking out some things in our aft lazarette before we were heading across the Pacific. And it was just like, oh my gosh, if something went wrong, like, do we know how to fix an autopilot? No. And would you want to do this at sea?
I think it's just a good reality check, that photo, because autopilot parts are normally strewn about in the bowels of the boat. And, you know, I get a little bit seasick sometimes. And the last thing I want to be doing is hanging upside down trying to diagnose, you know, electrical failures or whatever. So I just think it's be forewarned of what it can be like.
And how reliable is your autopilot? So these are just some photos of when we were in Fiji. I guess we talk about Fiji a lot. Just wonderful, wonderful cruising. And we'd been there for about a month, and we were getting ready to head off on the next leg. And I remember we were in Buda Point Marina with a bunch of other cruising boats that we'd been sailing with. And we had been waiting for this big weather window to arise. A huge system had kind of blown through. And we all left early in the morning. We had gone through the process of checking out, and we were motoring through the lagoon out to the pass to get outside of the reefs. And we were motoring, and I remember all of a sudden, like, the boat just went like 90 degrees, just like zoom. And we were like, okay, that's weird. And we had the autopilot on and tried it again. And the autopilot just could not, kept doing it, could not hold the course.
I thought it was something that was relocated close to the Fluxgate compass or something like that, but no.
We could not figure it out. But to be honest, for us, it didn't matter. So we were heading off on a 500 nautical mile passage, and our autopilot was broken, but we didn't actually mind because we knew we were never going to be using our autopilot once we got out into the open water and started sailing and using the Hydrovane. So I don't think we ever fixed it.
We didn't fix it until we got to Australia.
But this is kind of, I just go back, it's so funny how that was in 2013 and grid files we didn't have the fancy grid viewers that we do nowadays. But that's what we were waiting to kind of blow through. And one interesting point I always think of here is how upset I would have been from a social aspect if we had had to turn back and go back and stay in Fiji longer, waiting for parts or waiting to fix that autopilot, because we were cruising with like 3 or 4 other boats at that point, and they were all fine heading off. And especially places like the South Pacific, where like you're waiting out these systems and then you're doing kind of jumps to the next island group, we probably never would have seen our friends again. So
yeah, the weather windows in the South Pacific, they're few and far. Like you have to wait long periods. It could be 3 or 4 weeks before a weather window. So,
but yeah, anyways, it's just kind of all about how it's one of the things that people do get stuck waiting for. And we have a tiller pilot. So we hook this up, and on our current boat, we have an autopilot. We have this tiller pilot that we hook up to the Hydrovane, which we use all the time if we're motoring. And then of course, when we're sailing, we use the Hydrovane. So we are covered on steering.
The tiller pilot's a great option, and you can do that with I think all Windvanes, depending on how you hook it up. But the beauty of it is that they're relatively inexpensive. Any tiller pilot will drive it, $350 for Raymarine 1000. Because the tiller pilot is driving, in our case, the semi-balanced Hydrovane rudder, it takes no power to turn. So the specs it is rated for are completely irrelevant. And I did that with skepticism, and I was amazed at how well it worked for motoring and light conditions. And of course, in heavier sailing, you're going to be using the vane. So we do actually get a lot of customers who just go with a small tiller pilot on the Hydrovane, and that's it. That's their primary steering demands. And
just a tiller pilot, no below deck autopilot.
Yeah.
It's true. Yeah, so I'd like to see if everyone's still awake at this point. This is the reason why we were so set on getting to that island of Tana in Vanuatu.
Talking about, look at that. Holy, look at the lava down there. That is insane.
Now that was cool to experience with our other cruising boats, other friends.
We made that weather window.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is, so on the left there, that's a good example of showing the complexity of an autopilot system. I always like to say that when you're relying on an autopilot, and don't get me wrong, we're not autopilot haters. We think they're fantastic, but they are dependent on a lot of different systems on board. It's not just the autopilot itself. It's the charging systems to support it. It's the batteries with sufficient voltage, and anywhere along those linkages, you could be without an autopilot.
Something that's so nice about a Windvane is you're always in sync with sail trim. So you're always sailing efficiently, and the windier it gets, the better they perform. And we were going to talk a little bit about catamarans too. And I have a little bit later, have some really great feedback from saying the same thing about using a Hydrovane on a catamaran. The windier it gets, the better they perform. And of course, quiet.
They're not noisy.
When we're at sea, we sleep in the aft cabin off watch, and it's quiet.
Yeah. The autopilot is fairly close and it's very noisy.
Emergency steering is one other consideration. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. We hear it on an almost monthly basis. Stories of people who have had a steering issue at sea, or either now interested in pursuing a Windvane that includes an emergency rudder, or have had a situation and luckily had a way to steer their way out of it.
And a lot of it, I think, stems from the fact that just modern boats and the way they're designed with spade rudders, you are more vulnerable to hitting something and causing damage. In a lot of the time, it's not just rudder failure, it's a quadrant failure, it's a linkage failure somewhere. If you have hydraulic steering, it's an airlock. They're pretty complex systems, and there's a lot that you need to sort of stay on top of. These are the photo on the left here is a good example. This is a new build, high quality Scandinavian Motiva 49. And he was sailing to the Canaries, and middle of the night, he heard a big bang and his rudder sheared right off, right at the hull joint. And so he ended up, fortunately, at Hydrovane, diverted course, and it took him 5 days to get into the
He was
Cape
sailing
Verdes.
from the Canaries and across the Atlantic and diverted to the Cape Verde Islands and made it. You know, he had no main rudder and was just using the Hydrovane rudder, and of course, completely depowered the rig and the sails, but made it.
Yeah, and on the right there, that's actually our current boat, which is a Juno 43, and you can see the difference between the rudders. So that's a good example of a spade rudder and showing how vulnerable it can be to impact. And interestingly, all modern boats, even hovercrafts now, are being built with spade rudders. So you look at a common question that we get is, you know, how can that smaller rudder steer my big, powerful boat? And the answer is actually a couple things. One, the Hydrovane rudder has a lot more leverage because it's further aft on the boat, so we can get away with using less surface area. Two, the main rudder on your boat is actually only that size for maneuvering in marinas. When you're at sea, you're actually probably only using 25 to 30% of your actual rudder.
Yeah, if you're having
power.
to do this while you're sailing,
yeah,
there's something wrong.
There's something wrong for sure. The other part of it is that when you're using the vane, your main rudder is a big part of the equation because it's actually acting as a trim tab, but it's also making the boat more stable because it's got more surface area fixed. So we find that on our boat, when the vane is steering, the motion is nicer and we don't skew around quite so much.
Less yaw, for sure. Installation. So this is a common question, and I love this photo. This is you follow her at Wilderness of Waves, solo female across the Pacific, and yeah, it's just a great story.
Yeah.
So it sounds great, but it won't fit my boat's davits, arch, radar mast, transom, etc. You might be saying this. For Hydrovane, there's a lot of adaptability, which is why we configure units very boat specifically. Even sister ships don't always use the same configuration. The brackets are usually pretty set. That's just based on what you need, based on the boat's transom. The shaft assembly, we actually manufacture shafts in 10-inch increments, so we can go shorter or longer as needed. Of course, we have the different vanes that we mentioned, so a stubby vane to fit below an arch. We also have something called the extendable vane, which is even more power, and we're using that for a lot of the really big, fast boats. Catamarans as well are often using that. So we'll show you some photos here, and hopefully this will make a bit more sense.
Yeah, so this is a good example of dealing with modern swim steps. I would say nowadays 80% of our installs are mounted off center. It's very rare that they would be mounted on the center line. In a lot of cases, it's actually better to go off center because it gets the Hydrovane rudder into cleaner water. And you can see this one on the Beneteau, that's probably 2, maybe 3 feet off center. Hovergrassi would be sort of 12 to 15 inches offset. The offset really has no effect on performance, even when you're sailing upwind. If we look on the next slide, you can see this is an example of a modern Hansa 505 with a drop-down transom, and people say, well, wow, that's way over on the port side. What's going to happen when we're sailing upwind? And the reality with these boats is that they're not really designed to be heeling way over on their ear. If you're heeling more than 10, 15 degrees, the boat's just overpowered and you're plowing more water. So rudder immersion generally is not a problem. If you're ever concerned about it, the shaft can be lowered so that the rudder is deeper in the water before you go on longer passage. But the reality is almost no one does it, but you have that option.
For multi-hulls, we are actually doing a lot of multi-hulls, and we hope to be multi-hull sailors at some point soon, maybe not. The really important thing is to get the Hydrovane as far aft on one pontoon as possible. So you want the maximum leverage. We often use something called an extended heading tube. And if you look closely at some of those photos, you can see that the point between the heading tube is actually up here. So the vane pivot point is 12 inches higher, just because often catamarans have that high superstructure.
Yeah.
And we said before, we can use our extendable vane to give even more power. So there's a lot of things. The Hydrovane rudder is also much, much bigger than it used to be. So it's a different shape. It's 6 inches longer. And to support that, we make the shaft, the inner shaft that spins within this tube here, out of super duplex stainless steel, which is even stronger than 316. So there's a lot of things that we've done over the past 10 years to be able to steer bigger boats.
Yeah, and there was always a bit of a misconception that Windvanes don't work on multi-hulls. And I think a lot of that stemmed from the high-speed round-the-world racers that were going so fast. And that is the limitation for catamarans or trimarans, is boat speed. You know, if you're doing 15 knots and 18 knots of wind, there's not a lot of wind left over for the vane, and the boat accelerates so fast that the vane wants to follow. So it just doesn't work. But most cruising catamarans are doing monohull speeds plus a bit more. And there's no reason why a Hydrovane can't steer that. And in a lot of situations, it's actually a better application because the boats don't heel. So we can go way off to one side. And the key really is that leverage, getting the Hydrovane rudder as far aft. If the unit is mounted on the cross beam further forward, you're not going to get good performance. So you got to get it as far aft as possible.
Yeah, I had an email last week from a customer, and they're sailing on a Prout 50, so a decent size. And I had asked, for a little bit of feedback, and they just said, we got in 1 hour ago after a 700 nautical mile trip, which we used the Hydrovane 100% of the time. The trip was from Hawaii to California, but we had to turn back due to the rough seas. The Hydrovane worked in the heaviest of weather. So that was on one catamaran. And then this Nautilus 47, this boat Shine,
The photo on the right there.
Photo on the right. So we asked them, what conditions did you use the Hydrovane in? And responded, whilst cruising full time, we would use it just about all the time with the exception of short trips under engine. 8 knots was the minimum we would need for it to keep a reasonable course. Did high boat speeds affect vane performance? Not really. The cruising cat is generally fairly heavy and doesn't shoot off at high speeds and gusts like racing versions do. In 3 years and 20,000 miles, I never found a limit or condition where it didn't work. So that was really great to hear. And we have not sailed personally with a Hydrovane on a catamaran, but again, we hope to.
Yeah, we did sail on our friend's lagoon catamaran in Tonga. And it was
Not with a Hydrovane though.
No, but it was just interesting to see. And one of the things I always thought was, catamarans are so fast, but they're not. When you're cruising, you want to be conservative, and keeping the boat upright and comfortable is really the most important part of it all. Heavy boats. Yeah, so the limitation in boat size really varies depending on the boat and how well it balances. On the left there, you see at the Southampton Boat Show, we were exhibiting, and this boat was on display. It's an Oyster 575. That's probably one of the bigger monohulls we've done with just a single unit.
And he did the Oyster around the
He did the Oyster Rally, yeah. And if you're going up into real heavy boats, our solution is we go to 2 Hydrovanes. So we mount one on either side of the transom. And we're starting to do more and more of this, which is quite exciting because it allows us to do bigger, heavier boats. And really, 2 Hydrovanes is 2 rudders is double the power. So we don't really have a huge upper limit,
And small boats, the smallest boat we've ever fitted is this 9-foot sailboat, which is a really interesting story. And the plan was to sail to Hawaii. They didn't quite make it, but it was really interesting that the Hydrovane worked and steered well. I mean, the vane was almost as big as the sail, to be honest. Yeah. Davits, I love davits. They're something we added to our boat while we were in San Diego before heading back to Mexico. And with a lot of wind vanes, if there's some moving parts, it is a little bit more challenging to have davits. But the Hydrovane, because there are actually no moving parts on the outside, as long as the vane can pivot above and the rudder can turn below, we just rest, and we actually lash our dinghy off on the Hydrovane, so it becomes a lashing point. And aerial obstructions, lots of cruising boats have solar arches, and again, we just generally use a shorter shaft and the stubby vane, which has, it's actually a slightly bigger surface area than the standard, so there's no effect on performance.
It was designed specifically for arches.
what breaks? I mean, this was a great testimonial. This is, if anyone was watching the Golden Globe race in 2018, and when Jean-Luc Van den Heide won it in 2019, this race, all of the boats were using Windvanes. They were not allowed to have any equipment that wasn't available 50 years ago. So it really was a battle of the Windvanes in some way. And Jean-Luc made it in. He's a really, really excellent sailor, and
Been around the world many times.
he changed nothing on the Hydrovane the whole time. If you were watching very closely, you would have noticed there was the rudder locking pin broke, I think when he was in the Atlantic when he was on the way down, but it actually was a pin that he had made specially. So he had to get in his little inflatable dinghy out there and go on and get the rudder back on and put our pin in, and it was fine for the rest of the way. But a really, a great testimonial to how well built these things are for Southern Ocean sailing.
Yeah, so in terms of cost, anywhere between sort of 5,000 and 7,000, depending on the size of the boat, type of brackets you need. And this would be pretty consistent with most manufacturers as well, depending on where they're coming from and your boat type, of course. But it sounds like a lot, but the reality is it gives you so much. You're not just getting a self-steering system, you're getting an emergency rudder. You're getting something that's not relying on any other part of the boat. And I know for me, on our boat, and especially now that we have young ones on board, having that confidence of knowing that we have a system that's not dependent on other things is pretty huge. The other big part of it is, emergency rudders, as we talked about, having that extra rudder for those what if scenarios that can happen. And for a lot of people, it is a once in a lifetime purchase, meaning you're not buying multiple units. Some people will take them from their one boat to the other. That can have its own set of complexities because every system is different, but
I think a lot of people are often considering, you might have your below deck autopilot and you're looking at adding a second autopilot, which some boats do. So when you look at it that way, considering a Windvane is probably a similar cost and can give you a lot more.
Cost-wise, carrying backup parts for an autopilot or a second autopilot would be similar, if not maybe a bit less. But when you actually throw in the installation costs and everything else, it can actually be just as much, if not more. So it is a good alternative.
Now, just to cap things off, Will mentioned how the confidence now that we're sailing with young kids on board, and with the Salty Dog Rally, I feel like there are a lot of families. This is just a video that we love, and this is on a recent passage in December down in Mexico, and what life looks like aboard our boat.
And why you need good self-steering.
Yeah.
To tame the monsters.
Hugo, are you so hungry? You get excited for dinner? Come to the bar. Come to the bar. Kippy, come to the bar. We're serving at the bar tonight. I think that diaper's a bit wet. Kippy, come to the bar. Come up to the bar for your dinner. Come up to the bar for your dinner. Okay. So good. Sunset at sea. Just sitting over the Baja. Ernie steering. Seas have calmed down. Big fish got away already. But it's really serene considering our situation with the twins. Awesome. I used to think sailing was a challenge, and now that we're sailing with twin toddlers, it's we need all the help we can get. So here's some information: our website, hydrovane.com, our email addresses, and you can follow Hydrovane. And we are now gonna, I guess, do some Q&A. So I see we have some questions, and I think I'll just open up the chat and just want to thank everyone, of course, for joining us and for your participation here.
Hopefully one day we'll see you at a boat show live.
Yeah. I'm just going to stop the share so that I can do it this way. There we go. Awesome. Okay. So I'll just start at the top and then we'll go through with the questions. Does boat size play a part in the decision to use an autopilot versus Windvane? Larger batteries have more battery capacity and therefore a larger percent go to autopilots. Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, boat size, as we talked a bit about earlier,
Mhm.
big boats obviously require longer shafts, different setups configuration wise. But I think it really just comes down to if the boat can be balanced well and you're not pushing it hard and you're not surfing, if you have a surfing boat that's doing, 10, 12 knots fairly consistently in light airs, then you'll be just fine using most Windvane manufacturers. Of course, you'd want to check with them to see, what works best. If for us, anything above 25-ton displacement, then we start to look at whether a second unit would be necessary or you just stick with a single unit.
Do any connect through the emergency tiller connection?
Yeah, I know some of the servo pendulum units do that. If it's not a good run to get to the wheel or the tiller, they'll actually go onto the emergency tiller. The advantages of that is you can have less friction in the system, so you're not having to overcome multiple blocks to get to the main rudder. And in a lot of cases, it's a shorter run to the emergency rudder compared to the main helm. So yeah, some do that. It can be a little bit clunky if you don't have an easily accessible emergency tiller, but it is an option.
Yeah, so and that would be for a servo style system where you are connecting to your main rudder, and then an auxiliary rudder system, it's irrelevant because you're not even trying to connect. Yeah. From Brad, so is the vane always trying to get rudder back to midships? The vane is always trying to bring, when it's standing tall, the boat is on course.
Yeah, you got to read the rest of it. So one well-known Hydrovane user likes to combine hydro with electric autopilots to take pressure off the autopilot. Can you comment on that? Yeah, so that's an interesting one. With auxiliary rudder systems, because it's using its own rudder, you do have that option of running the Hydrovane or whatever system it is in tandem with your main autopilot. The only scenarios that you really generally need to do that is if you're in real heavy conditions, the boat is starting to surf, and it's taking off. And what you do is you run the autopilot on very low gain. So it's basically on standby most of the time. And then the vane is steering that last or the autopilot steering the last 20%. We only, on our Pacific crossing, we had a Beneteau First 405, which is a fairly performance oriented boat. The only times we ever had to do that was when we were in real squally conditions. So if squalls were coming up, we would just have the autopilot engaged with the vane. Once we get through the squall and things have settled down, then you disengage the autopilot and away you go. But for a majority of your trade wind sailing and, sort of normal to heavy conditions, you should be just using the Hydrovane.
And I think you're probably talking about John Crusher. We know he loves using it that way. And that's great. How did you decide which vane to buy? Well, we're very lucky being a family business that we chose Hydrovane.
Yeah. I try to answer that from a non-subjective viewpoint, but I know that a lot of it does depend on the boat. For example, servo pendulum systems can work really well on boats that have spade rudders and have our tiller steered, because there's the least amount of friction, the shortest distance from the actual vane to the tiller, and that's an ideal application for a servo pendulum unit. Center cockpits with long runs and lots of friction in the steering, that's a different story. But I think you just think about what type of boat you're looking at, what your budget is. Auxiliary rudders, again, give you that emergency rudder capabilities. Some of all the servo pendulum systems, I believe now offer add-ons onto their systems to make it an emergency rudder if needed. But when you add those on, cost-wise, there's almost no difference between the different systems.
What are the mounting options for the different types of vane? Some vanes are required to be mounted on the center line, and can the Hydrovane be mounted off center? I would say that in terms of—
it says the video just answered my question.
Oh, good. I think one thing should be pointed out though. I mean, the installation for the Hydrovane and our brackets and how robust it is a little bit different from the servo systems because we are a completely independent steering system.
The
We
loads are high.
the loads are really, really high. And that's why we use like cast anodized aluminum. We don't use any bent stainless, just because the loads are a lot higher with an auxiliary rudder system. But you can go off center, so that is nice.
Off center, as I said, is generally recommended. Not only does it keep the transom or the swim ladder functional, but it gets the rudder into cleaner water, so it's not in line with the main rudder and the keel.
How heavy is the rudder? That's a good question.
Can you lift it?
Yeah. Oh yeah. So it's about 20 pounds.
It's 10 kilos.
And it's about half that in the water. So once you have it in the water,
yeah, the density of the water will pick up some of
Yeah.
the buoyancy, so it's not as heavy as it looks. It's manageable. It's made of solid nylon.
Yeah. And again, we always say put it on before you head out to sea. So you're putting it on either in a marina or from the dinghy. Or if you have a swim step, it's easier for us to put it on.
Next question, how is it dead downwind? Well, you never really want to be sailing DDW, dead downwind, because that's a potential accidental jibe point of sail. So normally we run at least 10 degrees off of the stern, and usually we just go wing on wing with the Genoa pulled out to windward, and then the mainsail and a preventer going downwind. Some boats use twin headsails, just depending on the configuration. But if you get that set up properly, that wing configuration for us basically took us most of the way across the Pacific. It was bulletproof.
Yeah, that's our favorite sail plan for sure. And dead downwind, I mean, it's certainly a lot better than an autopilot where your risk of an accidental jibe is going to be greater. At least when we're going downwind, if the wind were to shift, well, again, our course just shifts. So the chance of jibing accidentally are pretty low.
I always felt more comfortable being off watch when the vane was steering with our wing on wing configuration, just knowing that we wouldn't get into those accidental jibe scenarios. You'll also find, I find with headsails, when you're going wing on wing, make sure you have one with a fairly high cut clew. So you get good visibility underneath. There's not a lot of helm, and the sail size is somewhat similar to your mainsail. Sometimes that can be a little bit harder to achieve with a fractional rig, but with a typical masthead rig, that works really well.
Does the Hydrovane's rudder have enough power for multi-hull? And I think we probably answered that as well, but yeah, leverage is key. So just getting it as far aft on the transom as possible.
Yeah, the installations that work best are as far aft as possible. We go with longer shafts to deal with all the superstructure. Dirty airflow from structures on any type of installation are generally not an issue for us, because the vane is so large and we have a lot of flexibility in shaft sizes, and a lot of manufacturers will also have ways of dealing with all of that stuff. So that's not a problem.
What is the largest boat you have installed a Hydrovane on? Displacement and LO.
And length overall.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one. You saw in some of those photos, there was the Oyster 575.
Schooner?
Oh, the schooner Rainbow. He was 40-ton displacement.
Wow.
He actually had no engine. So he just used a push boat when he was in port to get him in and out. That was a really heavy boat, and it did it. Oyster 575. What else did we do? Yeah, Hansa 588. I mean, a lot of it is not so much the size of the boat, it's the displacement and how fast it sails that are kind of the determinant of whether a vane would work or not. But going to the double units, this is a fairly new thing for us. Is pretty exciting because it does get us into some really big, heavy boats, and it works well. So you just mount one on basically either side of the transom. You don't need to have the two units tied together. You can kind of trim them out as you need to using the remote course sighting line. But that's your solution for really heavy boats. But most cruising boats, if you're sailing short-handed as a couple or family, you're not going much bigger than 55, 60 feet.
On a canoe stern, if on center, aren't you in the dirty flow just aft of the main rudder?
On a canoe stern,
So if you mount center line, I mean,
yeah.
many Hydrovanes are also mounted center line.
You need 8 inches of fore and aft clearance.
Yeah.
That's sort of our conservative limitation between the rudders. But like Pacific Sea Crafts, Valiants, Tyanas, they're all mounted centerline, and I've never heard of an issue. So yeah, that's generally not a problem.
When not using the system for local sailing and marina berthing, what can you remove? And is the structure that is left easily damaged during stern to mooring? Yeah, that's a really good question. So the rudder comes off, the vane comes off, and if you are leaving your boat for a long period or not using the vane for a long period, you can actually take the entire drive unit off. So it's just these two bolts here, and there's one bolt on this side, and then you lift the entire thing off.
Bear hug it.
I won't demonstrate that. It's probably a two-person job, but it is possible.
Managing the rudder, I've actually talked to a lot of full keel or partially full keel boats that don't maneuver well, and they find that when they actually leave the Hydrovane rudder on and use the Hydrovane rudder, it actually improves maneuverability. And we actually went out on a Tradewind 35 at the start of the Golden Globe race in France on the last race. And he had his Hydrovane rudder on all the time. And what he did is he had two bungee cords on either side of the tiller so that the rudder always went back to center. But when he wanted that extra maneuverability, he would just basically lean back to a tiller extension on the Hydrovane, use the Hydrovane rudder, and the boat had a much tighter turning radius than it would have otherwise. So it can actually become beneficial. But if you don't want to deal with it, you got to just get down there or get a boat hook on the pin and get the rudder off.
Yeah, and this is, I think, more for leaving, like taking, sorry.
No, he's just asking.
Marina berthing. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it is vulnerable, so put fenders around it. You know, if you're going to be backing into a concrete wall, you want to make sure you've got something between it.
Yeah, we normally in marinas we're normally stern in. We just make sure we have extra lines.
The fender step is a good fender to get around it.
Who installs the Hydrovane in the Caribbean? My boat is in Tortola. We have a number of people who have installed on our website. I'd have to go and look, but
I don't know as many in Tortola.
maybe not in Tortola.
Usually in the Caribbean, we find that the businesses sort of change names and ownership fairly quickly. So it's hard to keep track of who to recommend. Like in Antigua Rigging does installations, but most riggers or boatyards that have someone skilled or competent can do the install. You don't have to have experience of actually installing a Hydrovane.
A lot of people DIY. I know that's another question there. Yes. I mean, if you look at this installation here, so this would be an example of a boat that just has a slight reverse transom, and there's 4 holes in the transom there. So
it's just that easy.
two for the top bracket and 2 for the bottom bracket. And then the tube that is on the top bracket, we supply those at a longer length, and you're cutting to size during the installation. So for the installation, the only thing that is totally critical is that the shaft is vertical, or as vertical as you can get it on a boat. And then with the double strut bracket, the one that has 2 arms, when necessary, again, we're just providing longer tubes and you cut them down. So I would say it's not overly complicated.
It's a boat project though. Everything takes longer than you think.
Add 2 days.
But we have good installation video, and then actually some customers of ours have also put together some pretty good installation videos, so you can watch on YouTube of how others have done it. The concept of mounting the brackets is no different from mounting a deck cleat or any sort of deck hardware. You got to have good backing plate on the inside. But if you do know of someone, a rigger or a shipwright that you know that you trust, they can definitely install a Hydrovane. This is a good question. What should we expect in terms of boat speed loss with the auxiliary rudder? Well, I can only speak to the Hydrovane, but I would say it's almost non-existent in terms of boat speed loss when you're using the vane, because you're sailing more efficiently, meaning your main rudder's fixed, and you're actually using less surface area to move your boat to keep it on course. So I've actually had some racers tell me that the boat will sail faster and more efficiently with the Hydrovane compared to the main rudder. So boat speed loss is not an issue. The rudder is also a foil, so it's got very low drag, and you'll find that when you're using the vane, or if you're not using the vane and you just let it free trail, it almost has no impact on boat speed. But of course, that's very hard to measure, and it depends on the boat.
Good. I
So-
think that was the end of the questions. But if anyone has any more questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to answer. And I want to thank you all for listening as well.
Yeah, it's fun doing these, and these are all good questions. So it challenges us.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah and Will. This was great information, and I loved your demonstrations and your videos. So really, really nice presentation. I'll just give anyone another second here if you have any other questions for Sarah and Will.
Thanks for the feedback.
Well, we really appreciate you doing this and your support of Salty Dogs. So thank you so much.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. We're happy to be here, and we hope to make it to the Atlantic one day.
But we will be at the Annapolis Boat Show if it happens in the fall.
Yeah.
So if you do go to the show, come by our booth and say hi.
Yeah, we're always at the Annapolis show in the fall. So
In the hot and sweaty 8
we don't go to the Newport Boat Show. That was just a question there.
Yeah,
our only East Coast show is Annapolis.
It conflicts with the Southampton Boat Show.
Yeah.
All right, well, it looks like we've got all the questions taken care of. Again, thank you so much, and thank you everyone for attending, and we'll go ahead and call it a day. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Barb.
thank you so much.
Mhm.
Bye. Bye, everyone.